In terms of concepts of the environment, a lot of the metaphors given by students reflect the environmental principles. These different environmental principles include nature knows best, everything changes, all life is important, everything is connected, ours is a finite Earth, everything must go somewhere, we are all stewards. We won't go through each principle extensively. I'll just highlight some points which I have picked up some lessons from during years of work in community-based natural resource management. Nature knows best. There are processes in nature that sustains life and promotes self-healing. Biogeochemical cycles provide feedback to the system to adapt to changes. In this diagram, we see that the Earth is practically a life-sustaining engine that gets its fuel from the sun. Solar energy is converted by producers or plants into food, which is consumed by consumers or animals. Consumers eventually die, and decomposers break down the meat into its basic components that become nutrients that are eventually used by all. It can also be noted that each process produces heat. My mechanical engineering background would look at this heat as a degree of disorder that accumulates in nature and that will later lead to its destruction. This is a complete reversal from a biological perspective that looks into evolution as life's and nature's way of adapting to changing conditions. We learned in elementary science that water just goes into an evaporation and condensation cycle. Water is quite abundant. It changes to solid, liquid, and gaseous phase in the process. It's quite abundant and we practically do not lose it. So why is there so much fuss about conserving water? Elementary students will be quick to answer that most of the water are salt water and that less than 3% is fresh water. Moreover, 1.7% are frozen in polar ice caps, mostly inaccessible to humans. 0.8% are in fresh groundwater. Rivers where humans get its fresh water accounts for only 0.0002%. So that's quite a few. And we haven't even discussed how much of that is contaminated. So it's not just quantity, the question is more about the quality and distribution of potable water. The carbon chemical cycle is another controversial issue. Why is there an issue with too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere if it's naturally there? The bulk of the interaction has always been the sea and the atmosphere. The big difference is that much of the carbon stored in the land is being extracted and released to the surface. From fossil fuels for energy or for production of plastics, this extraction is changing the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and in the seas, causing global warming. We'll discuss this more later. Another cycle I want to show is the phosphorus cycle. It's a relatively limited cycle which revolves around the land. This is instrumental in agricultural production. The key takeaway here is that there are key nutrients that serve as limiting factors to the production of an ecosystem. Each ecosystem will have these set limiting factors that determine its carrying capacity. These will be critical in defining natural resource management strategies. Let's spot the difference. If we compare these two biogeochemical cycles, we notice that the phosphorus cycle on the left is predominantly land-based while the carbon cycle is more atmospheric. In terms of scope, distribution is quite narrow for the land-based phosphorus cycle and quite extensive for the atmospheric-based processes. We have to recognize that some issues would need just local action while others would require global scale action. Everything is connected. Living and non-living things interact and affect each other. Each react to changes in each one. Sometimes we forget about our connectedness because there is a delay of years and decades before we feel the impact in our lives. I highly recommend watching this YouTube video, How Wolves Change Rivers. It will show how the reintroduction of wolves changed not only the population of the deer, but also the behavior of rivers. The food web is a clear example of how we are connected to the food we eat. People are usually placed at the top of the food chain. In other ecosystems, other animals are at the top. Why are some conservation projects centered around a single species? The Philippine eagle, panda, whales, shark are shared. Specific species serve as keystone indicators of the health of an ecosystem. Unless the action is only to rescue injured animals, the strategy to save the keystone species entails a rehabilitation of the entire ecosystem. So in terms of communication, it may be easier to brand it around cute animals, but the strategy is around saving the entire ecosystem. In the predator-prey diagram, we see that it is not just the predator, but both the predator and prey that control the population of each other. In the bioaccumulation diagram, we see how mercury accumulates and magnifies as it goes up the food chain. The impact on our health will not be evident immediately. In the marine coastal ecosystem, the mangrove, seagrass, and coral ecosystems interact with one another. From the ocean, waves are first slowed down by the coral reefs, then further reduced by the seagrass beds before being stopped by the mangrove forest. From the other direction, mangroves provide a buffer for the flow of brackish water to the sea, which is detrimental to the corals. It also traps sediments from flowing directly to the seagrass beds. Seagrass beds further filter these sediments in order not to suffocate the corals. Biologically, the three ecosystems connect the life cycle of various fish. There's also a division and exchange of nutrients across the three ecosystems that ensure the continuity of living creatures. A big issue nowadays is the proliferation of mangrove reforestation projects that plant propagules over seagrass beds. Not only are the most popular replanted mangrove species not suited to these sites, there is a notion that one ecosystem is more superior than the other. We have to recognize that each ecosystem is important. Some natural resource habitation projects are misplaced or replace already thriving ecosystems. Which leads us to the next environmental principle. All life is important. Biodiversity, including diverse cultures, enhance resistance of ecosystems. The Philippines is at the center of the most biodiverse region in the world. We have more species packed for every square kilometer. The survival of the fittest means that each species fills a niche or a function to make the ecosystem thrive. This is why the introduction of a new or alien species in an ecosystem can cause a major imbalance. The Earth is divided into different zones, as defined by its climate. Each zone has its own peculiar set of biodiversity. The two main characteristics of the tropics is that it receives much sunlight and rain, with usually just two distinct seasons. The temperate zone, for example, is characterized by its 4 seasons. I grew up learning from Sesame Street and was taught that you can determine the age of trees by counting the rings in its trunk. But when you do cut a tree, you will likely not see the distinct rings. Those rings are marked of the rapid growth during summer and the stunted growth during winter. Foreign concepts to tropical trees. In my previous NGO, we arranged for a British marine biologist to volunteer to help us out in our coastal resource management project. We ended up training her on coastal resource management instead, since we didn't immediately realize that there were no coral reefs in the UK. In temperate countries, there are less diversity but more of the same species distributed in its ecosystem. On the other hand, the tropical ecosystem would have a wide range of diversity, but only few of the same species exist in the ecosystem. This is true not just in terms of the forest ecosystem, but to all other ecosystems in these zones. As such, the large tree plantation, agricultural monocropping, and other fish farming strategies may very well thrive in temperate areas, but these are major alterations to the tropical ecosystem. The takeaway is to be wary of natural resource management practices from the west or from the north. This may not necessarily be appropriate to our unique ecosystem. Even within the country, we have different climates. The resource management practices in Mindanao should be very different from that in Luzon. The Sierra Madre mountain range facing the Pacific Ocean is very wet and holds an extremely different biodiversity compared to the dry Cagayan Valley on the other side of the mountain. In general, the spread of flora would be horizontal since plants would be relatively stationary. The more mobile and migratory animals, such as birds and fish, would have movements that are vertical. In a more community-based setting, a horizontal spatial mapping is critical in defining natural hazards and distribution patterns of residences. A vertical transect walk would allow us to see the different species of plants and animals, the ridge approach. The forest ecosystem will have different species up in the canopy and down under the shrubs. In coastal ecosystems, you will have migratory fish in the upper waters and more territorial species near the bottom of the sea. So if you want to place an artificial reef for biodiversity, a tall structure would host more types of species than a flat structure on the ocean floor. Does being green mean necessarily being environment friendly? Some would consider a golf course environment friendly. But why? Golf courses are heavily landscaped. The terrain has been altered. The trees, shrubs, grass, and even sand is artificially planted. Fertilizers and pesticides are heavily placed to keep the scenery lush green and the wildlife controlled. No, the reusing of wastewater to water the trees and the other ISO 1000 standards do not make golf courses eco-friendly. But not all artificial interventions are necessarily detrimental. On the right side, the forested mangrove forest planted by Kabalikat in Paseco protects the community from storm surges and protects the erosion of the reclaimed area. On the other hand, the left picture shows the multi-million peso dolomite beach nourishment that will not only be washed out eventually, it will also add to the polluted waters of Manila Bay. Pollution is nothing more but an over-nourished ecosystem. Which now leads us to the next principle. Everything must end up somewhere. Every commodity we produce will also produce waste. Every energy we convert will produce waste heat. This is the reason why most industries locate itself near rivers and bodies of water. Rivers and lakes not only provides water to drink and fish to eat, it is also a dumping ground for solid waste, wastewater, and the heat produced by its machines and power plants. Another environmental principle is that we have finite Earth. Even renewable resources such as fishery and forest resources become finite resources when production and extraction exceeds the carrying capacity of an ecosystem. As earlier shown in the phosphorus cycle, there would be multiple limiting factors in nature. The concept of simply adding more investment to produce more items has its own limit. The theory behind globalization, trade liberalization, and even one town, one product is that nations and communities should invest more on commodities where they have competitive advantage. This will mathematically produce more of all types of commodities everywhere. Tough luck if you have a competitive advantage in a low-value commodity. However, this kind of thinking is not necessarily sustainable. A good conceptual model to illustrate the limited carrying capacity of a natural resource base is the MSY, or the maximum sustainable yield in fisheries. The usual sipag at tiyaga concept is that the more effort and investment you make, the more profit you get. However, if we apply the biological limiting factor, there will be a limit on the amount of fish you can actually catch. There is a point that you will get the maximum sustainable yield, such that after this peak, your catch will steadily decline. If you apply economics to this graph, where your catch is your revenue and your effort or investment is your cost, you will be able to calculate your profit. You'll discover that the maximum profit is not at the maximum sustainable yield, but at a point lower than that, what we term as the maximum economic yield. Counterintuitively, you will actually have more profit with lesser sipag at tiyaga. Go beyond where the lines intersect and you will end up losing money with more effort, a state called economic overfishing. But do take note, this mathematical model applied in a tropical ecosystem needs to factor in complexities of high biodiversity and multiple interactions. Again, this model, good conceptually, was made in temperate countries, not tropical countries. The same concept applies with energy. While energy is never lost, just converted, it would be more sustainable to use more renewable energy, most of which comes from the sun. The previous argument is that non-renewable energy is cheaper than renewable energy. This is no longer the case, as more of the finite resources are being used up and getting more expensive. Solar panels are becoming more affordable with better technology. Locking up 25 years to import coal to feed our coal plants means locking up our future to more expensive and dirty fuel. However, take note that not all renewable energy is clean energy. Burning biomass adds to carbon emissions. Building large hydropower dams means inundating large forest lands and communities. Geothermal energy expels nutrients from the grounds that could harm the local communities. The next environmental principle is so obvious it has also become so controversial. Everything changes. The concept of evolution has been met with protests when it first came out, but it is now more acceptable. Let's now show the evolution of the Philippines geographically. This slide shows the current map of the country. The number at the upper right-hand corner is the date in terms of million years ago. So this is 50 million years ago. Though the shape is not geographically accurate, let's watch how the country appears every million years. Exciting and terrifying. Several takeaways from this. First, our land moved and it has not stopped moving. We are children of earthquakes. Second, our high biodiversity is a product of the diversity of our terrain. some land masses became connected, some were previously connected, and then became separated. The Tarsier was thought to be just present in Bohol but was later to be found in various parts of Surigao del Norte. Third takeaway, Palawan and Mindoro are more connected to the continental Asia. This explains why biodiversity in Palawan is different and why. Probably why malaria is high in these two areas. Also, relatively no earthquakes are felt in Palawan, which is why it has a lower construction factor of safety compared to other parts of the Philippines. It also means that very old land is present in Palawan and in this region, which is why natural gas and oil is more likely to be found in these disputed waters of the West Philippine Sea than any other part of the country. Before we proceed to climate change, any questions?